We don't need to hang on to the ideology. We don't need to prove to people that we're good people, because that, to me, that's just narcissism. You don't need to prove that you are a good person. You're standing up for the right thing. That's not what this is about. It's about our methods. Do our methods work? Is what we are doing effective and actually helpful?
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Cameron Harmon, author of What's Under the Mask. Got a fantastic, interesting story coming out of the military and going back to school, pursuing the path of therapy. And I thought it would be great to have an interesting conversation. So welcome, Cameron.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So starting off, I guess talk about a little bit about your journey. You have this military background, and then you decided to pursue higher education. What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, so I got out of the military in 2017. I'd been in the Army for 8 years, and I never thought I would go to school. I never thought I would use my benefits. I knew they existed, but I just never thought that I would use them. But COVID happened, and during COVID, my place of employment, they just couldn't afford to keep me full-time, and that sent me back to part-time work, and I just couldn't live like that. So somebody had recommended me. They're like, why don't you try going back to school, use the GI Bill. And then they were talking about how the GI Bill doesn't just pay for school, it pays you also while you're going to school. You get, in the military, it's called BAH, Basic Allowance and Housing. And what the GI Bill was paying me to go to school was more than I was making at my full-time job. So it was a no-brainer. And originally I was going to school to be a history teacher, and I realized quickly that is not what I wanted to do. I was not interested. I liked history, but I did not like the idea of being a teacher at that level. It just wasn't interesting to me. The classes that I was taking, even though they were interesting, it wasn't a good fit. And then I took my first couple of psychology classes, and that's really where I found my home. And I really got into psychology from that perspective. And I'm like, wow. And it was my sister that had recommended me. She's like, have you ever thought about being a therapist? She's like, you're really good at meeting people where they are and talking and listening. And I thought, man, I was like, that's got to be way too much school. Like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. I knew that, I needed at least a bachelor's degree. But then when I started looking into it, it really wasn't that much more school, as you know. And so I was like, I think I'm going to give it a shot. And I talked to my wife about it, and she was encouraging to me. So I just took a chance, and I completed my bachelor's last semester in the fall, and I started my graduate program this semester in the spring.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yeah, I was really drawn to psychology. My first psych class, I thought, I'm going to find something to do with this because this is so fascinating. I feel like psychology just opens up my mind in a different kind of way. One thing that I was really interested to talk to you about, and a big reason why I brought you on here, is your background with the military compared to what you're seeing in graduate school. It just seems like polar opposites. I was never in the military, but from what I know of the military, it's got a very pragmatic feel to it. Like, are we getting the job done or not? It doesn't matter how nice the idea sounds if you're not actually accomplishing it, right? And in so much of what I see in grad school, in any kind of critical theory or postmodern influenced discipline, it's how good does the idea sound regardless of if it accomplishes anything we want, right? I'm wondering if you see that contrast.
Absolutely. I think about that all the time. I had a moment the other day in class where we were discussing a book that we were reading, and several of my classmates were, kind of talking about how it was making them feel very emotional. And for me, I had a hard time resonating. I'm like, guys, this is just a book. It takes a lot more than that to push my button. It's not, obviously I have empathy. I've seen a lot of things, but I just feel like my tolerance for emotional stimulation is really high. I was in the military, but then I also worked in a jail for a year as an intern in a drug and alcohol addiction program, where I was exposed to a lot of stuff. I volunteered at a women's rehab facility, and I heard all of their stories. So sometimes I think that perspective, and part of that is the military. The kind of like the stoic idea for me is like, I just have this tolerance built up to where some things just don't reach me. And in full disclosure, sometimes I wonder, like, man, is that going to make me a bad therapist? But I don't think it will. I think it's just a matter of, like, this is where I'm at, and that's where other people are.
Yeah, my work background is in addiction treatment as well, and it was really jarring for me. You're seeing people die of overdose and suicide, and you listen to people's stories and they're just heart-wrenching, or gut-wrenching. It's really intense what people live through. And then you step into this very sanitized academic setting and you're supposed to, place a high value on microaggressions and pronouns. And, it's like, it's hard for me to, pretend like this is a life and death matter when you actually have been exposed to life and death matters.
100%, whether it was yeah. And, and I think you can relate to this. We were having a discussion and somebody was talking about, they were like, oh, this person had told me that they were interested in working in a jail too. I was like, oh, that's great. And they're like, yeah, especially since our focus is on social justice. And I was kind of like, and I didn't say it, but in my heart, what I wanted to say was like, do you know how many people in jail that I met with disclosed to me that they were interested in social justice, or they felt like anything social justice related was going to help them? Zero. You know why? Because their focus in jail is, my immediate focus needs, like food, clothing. Like some people in there, and this is a whole nother discussion, but in jails and prisons, inmates are responsible for their clothing and their food and their things. So like if they don't have money, they're going to wear the same loafers or shoes. And I saw inmates with these shoes that are just completely wrecked. Like they shouldn't even be wearing them. It's a little inhumane if you're asking me. And I'm like, dude, why don't you just get some new shoes? He's like, I don't have any money. Like that just blows me away. You know what I mean? Like, and I guess maybe in some perspective, social justice plays a part in that. But like to them, when I'm asking him, he didn't say, oh, because of this policy or this thing, I'm whatever. You know what I mean? I feel like sometimes our focus in this field is a little kiltered. It's unidirectional sometimes, and it's like, where's social justice going to fit into that? How is that going to help him get a new pair of shoes when, like no matter how many protests you do, that's not going to change the way that system works.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of this idea that I run into over and over and over again where it's like, okay, if this guy has like a job in jail, can he set aside a little bit of money for an extra pair of shoes? Like, how can we kind of plan for this to where we fix this situation? And the mindset that I run into is basically, well, it's not even worth our time to kind of pursue that route because none of these issues are really going to be fixed until we overthrow the capitalist system, right? It's just you got these grand ideas and you're ignoring so many of the smaller problems that are actually existing in people's lives.
1,000%. Like, and that, what you just described there's a word for that. That's called ideology, right? Mm-hmm. And when institutions and places are captured, ideologically captured, that's what you get, I mean. And I don't know what the solution is to that. I think that I thought a lot about this before we started the podcast. And here's something that I really think about. If people in our field think that we are immune to causing harm, or that the way that we do things might be wrong, then we have a critical problem. Because if you think about it in therapy, right, is the therapist always right? No. Is the client always right? No. Our job is to work together. So in that realm, it's like, great, we know how to think. We know how to be rational. It's like, we got to do these things. It's like our techniques are solid. But when it comes to rational thinking, sometimes it's kind of like, where did that go? If we, again, like I said, if we don't think that we can cause harm, I'm not saying that we are, but I'm saying that if you don't think that we are capable of causing harm or being destructive, that's not a healthy place to work from.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of another aspect is so much of this social justice language seems so disempowering. And often it's disempowering to the people who need it the most. Like I think back of clients that I've worked with who dealt with drug addiction and alcoholism and mental illness. Some of the things that they appreciate the most are the feeling of being able to take control of their lives. Like, I have agency and autonomy and I can direct where my future goes. And so much of the social justice language is like, no, you're a victim of the patriarchal white male capitalist system. They're basically trying to disempower you, so that you can kind of join into this big political project. But the result is you have very disempowered people who really need the help of kind of taking control of their life, and they're kind of being robbed of that in a sense.
100%. And if you really, for anybody that doubts this, for anybody watching this that is completely against what you're talking about, all I would suggest is go look at where their money is going. Where did the money for Black Lives Matter go? Right? Look at the money being spent by USAID. Nobody wants to talk about that. I just had a really serious conversation with somebody, a friend of mine, who it was completely unaware. Like, he knows what's going on politically, but he spent no time looking at that money. He was upset that these programs are being cut, but I'm like, have you looked? And I'm not saying all programs. That's, to be fair, I'm not saying all of these programs are bad, or that the money was, every penny is being spent wrong. But there's quite a few things that money was being spent on that is kind of wild. This is absolutely wild.
Yeah, it's like the USA thing, and a lot of other things that are being uncovered in the audit, I guess you'd say, is so much of what we're sold as grassroots movements have been astroturfed by Uncle Sam. It's the trans thing specifically is just wild. But a lot of the DEI stuff is not just an outcry of the marginalized. It's the professional managerial class who want job security.
Yeah, and something I actually messaged you about this on X, and this is something that people in our field should really think about. If universities and institutions do not comply with these new changes, and again, I'm not making an argument that they should or shouldn't or whatever. I'm just simply throwing out a thought. If they don't want to change, if they refuse to change, and then they start losing funding, what happens to our programs, the ones that you and I are currently in? If the organizations that accredit programs like ours refuse to change, there's going to be an institutional crisis at some point where you're going to have programs that can't be accredited because they're refusing to change their policies. And I think a question to think about is like, when are we going too far? How far are we willing to let? Because again, if the whole point is to help people, if we're really trying to help people, how can we help people if we are literally destroying our own field?
Yeah, it was interesting. I thought a lot about that article you sent me, because it's like you have two just juggernaut forces running headfirst into each other. And one is you got the Trump administration saying you have to get rid of all DEI stuff in academia. But with the counseling profession, KCREP demands that you essentially center your program around DEI. So who's going to win that face-off? It's either, essentially what, like if the Trump administration doesn't back down, you're basically going to have to completely restructure the counseling field. Like that's going to be a huge shakeup, and they're not going to go down quietly.
No, and again, that's why I sent that to you. I thought about it, and I asked, ironically enough, I asked Grok, the ex-AI, about it. I was curious. I was like, well, how much is this going to impact us? Like, what is this going to look like? You know what I mean? Because again, I just got started in my program. You're in at least the middle, maybe more than halfway through.
Towards the end.
Towards the end of your program. So it might not impact you as much, but for me, I mean, I've still got another 2 years in my program. So how are these changes going to impact us? And what does it look like if institutions, universities refuse to comply? I don't know. And something else I think about too is that, how, for like DOGE, for example, the Department of Government Efficiency, are they aware how deep the ties of DEI go into programs like ours? Are they aware of that? And if they're not, then maybe it won't impact us really at all. But I do wonder sometimes, like, is it even possible to do that much to impact programs like ours? I don't know. And again, you have to think about not everything about what our program, not everything about the DEI stuff is bad necessarily. Like, I think it's healthy to appreciate people's culture and include that in your process of thinking. Is there a way to still do that and it not be DEI? Like, I don't know. These are things I think about.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I think, for me, I would actually appreciate more multicultural education, because I feel like the so-called multicultural education that I'm getting is basically, some version of, as a white person, you're doing it wrong because you're probably a bigot, and therefore you need to have far left-wing politics. And there's no, I share this story, but there was this one time in my Counseling the Culturally Diverse class where my professor's talking about a story in class. I don't know are you using the Gerald Wing Sue book?
I'm not in that class. I'm not in a multicultural class yet.
Yeah, you'll probably use Sue. And there's this example in the book of like a white male therapist counseling a Latina woman with anxiety. And, it's just very obviously he's just bumbling it just in a imbecilic way. And I raised my hand. I'm like, look, I recognize I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes, given my inexperience, but what will be the correct way to counsel this woman? And the professor said, we're not going to go over that. And I later asked two women in my class, like, one was from Mexico, the other, her parents were from Mexico. I was like, could y'all explain this to me? Like, how does anxiety manifest differently in Latina women? They explained to me, like, for the next 20 minutes, what it looks like. I got more of a multicultural education in that 20 minutes than I did in 2 years of the program. Like, as much as we talk about diversity and multiculturalism, we're not actually touching on these things. It's just, white bad, therefore vote blue. That's the extent of what we're learning.
And something that people should consider, because again, I'm not advocating for any policies or left or right or whatever. I just really want people to actually think, right? When you're talking about, like, when people hear the words DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, okay? Diversity makes sense. Inclusion makes sense. Do you know what equity means? Bernie Sanders doesn't even know what the word equity means when he was asked about it. And if you read in some of these textbooks, and if you read in other policies what equity means, it means, from on paper, what it means is that, we make sure that everybody has access to resources. That sounds great. But what you're not being told is that the only way to make sure that everybody has access to resources is to make sure that you take them away from other people. And in this case, that's white people, wealthy people, people who are up on the higher levels of the totem pole. You have to take things away from them or make sure that they don't get them to make sure that other people can get them. And what happened in North Carolina is a perfect example. People were not allowed to get aid or help because that Trump sign's in their lawn. It doesn't matter whether you like Trump or not, whether you're left or right. That's wrong. That's wrong.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and the equity piece. It's really just like Marxism hiding behind race and other identity markers. That's really all it is. And I've noticed this is true of my university. I've seen it at University of Texas and a number of other schools. They're rebranding. They'll take DEI and call it the Office of Belonging. And it's the exact same people, the exact same mission statement. They just changed the name. It's like, it's very obvious what they're trying to do is, get around this new regulation. And I wonder how long we're going to play this kind of cat and mouse game of trying to catch them, breaking the rule or the spirit of the rule, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I think about that as well. And again, it's like I said just a little bit ago, like how far are these institutions willing to go? How far are they, how much are they willing to lose? Because right now, in my opinion, I think we're doing incredible damage to our reputation. And it's kind of like what people talk about with, vaccines, right? Like if you poo-poo a vaccine, you're encouraging people to not get it. In my opinion, I think that if we don't make some changes in our field, we're actually encouraging people to stay away from us. And I don't agree with this person, but Matt Walsh made a really long post about this. I really actually don't like Matt Walsh. I think he's a bit extreme. Yeah, you know what I mean? I think when people think about like what's wrong with the right, I think Matt Walsh is kind of one of those people. He just, I understand. And I should probably, let me actually clarify. I actually think that everybody on the left and the right are coming from a good place. Honestly, no matter how extreme they are, I think it's because they care. It's either extreme empathy or extreme fear. Everyone is acting out of one of those two places, in my opinion, to just clarify that. But Matt Walsh made this really long post, and I don't have it in front of me, but I would encourage people to go read it on his X account. He basically talked about how all psychiatrists, all therapists, all psychologists are ineffective, therapy doesn't work, and that we're basically quacks, and it's witchcraft. To that, and I'm summarizing. It was a very long post, but he has a pretty big influence.
Yeah.
And I live in Tennessee. He's talked about running for governor of Tennessee. What if somebody like that he's dangerous to our field? And I don't mean dangerous to people. I just mean to the field. Because if he was governor, do you really think that he would just not make policies or advocate for policies that reduce the ability of counselors and therapists? That's a thing that we have to really come to terms with. Again, that's why I said, like, how much are we willing to lose? How far are we willing to go?
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing that Matt Walsh post, and it hit me in the stomach. Just, I could feel my stomach churning. I remember how I felt reading that post, and I definitely disagreed with the post, and I spoke out. But a big part of the problem is there's enough quackery in the field of therapy to where you can put up a very good argument like that makes sense, And I've been trying to call out the quackery in various different ways in our field. And I've been very upfront. I'm not anti-psychiatry. I'm not anti-therapy. Like, I'm still, I'm not too far from being licensed as a therapist. I believe in therapy. I believe in good therapy. And I have sitting right here under my microphone, Abigail Schreier's book, Bad Therapy. I don't know if you read that one, and I love the book. But I feel like what Walsh and Abigail Schreier miss is, yes, bad therapy is bad and there's too much of it. But good therapy can be transformational. And I feel like that message is not getting out. It's not getting out by a lot of the conservatives who are just anti-therapy in general. And it's not getting out by a lot of the lefties who should be defending therapy, because they're one of their primary missions is to hide behind this social justice thing. And so you're missing really good therapy where you're connecting with another person and helping them transform their lives. Like, I'm a recovering alcoholic and drug addict. I have bipolar disorder. Therapy has helped me tremendously to turn my life around. Like, I believe in this at a core level. And it hurts when I see like people like this bash therapy, because I know there's some truth in it. But there's also a different story that I feel like is not being told nearly enough.
I totally agree. I mean, I feel like you nailed all the points there. And I think it might be important for people listening to have an example. Okay, I want to say two things here. One, I want to talk about, like, in our programs, and they talk about advocacy, right? Advocacy for your clients, advocacy for yourself. And I think that some of that is important, right? Like, when people, let's just say theoretically, like in my state, if Matt Walsh became governor and was trying to reduce the ability of counselors and therapists to be able to do their jobs, right? Like, that's something we would have to go to legislators for, to keep the ability to do it. But also, we brought this on ourselves. The field is good. If it didn't work, if therapy didn't work, if it wasn't effective, then it would have been gone a long time ago. But it's been around this long because it does work, because we know it works. We're getting better at it. So my thought process is, like, if we really wanted to be, have proponents of advocacy, why wouldn't we advocate for that? Like you said, like, why are we still hanging on to these ideologies? We don't need to hang on to the ideology. We don't need to prove to people that we're good people, because that, to me, that's just narcissism. You don't need to prove that you are a good person. You're standing up for the right thing. That's not what this is about. It's about our methods. Do our methods work? Is what we are doing effective and actually helpful? Because if that's the case, then that speaks for itself. It's just like, I took a class, a philosophy class called Logic and Reasoning. And it's a class designed for lawyers to have arguments in court, right? And one of the main things you learn is that arguments have to stand on their own merit. You can't attack the person making the argument, because that's a fallacy. So to say that, Matt Walsh is just a giant douchebag, he's an asshole, he's a right-wing, blah, 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 right? Okay, that's not defending your argument. You're just attacking him That doesn't help. That your argument has to make your argument. The field has to make our argument. We have to defend that. Attacking other people doesn't actually benefit anybody because it's a fallacy in the world of arguments. And the longer that we keep doing that, again, I just think it's just, you're just digging a deeper hole. Like, what is it that's important to us? Can we even come back from that? That's something I think about. Like, after reading that, the thing I thought about after reading that Matt Walsh post was, A, is this going to get worse? And B, can we come back from that?
Yeah. There's so many issues with the field. One is you brought up the narcissism, and I feel like it's kind of thankless in a lot of ways, or certainly humble, to sit there one-on-one with somebody and kind of grind it out and tinker with little thought processes to help with alleviating anxiety. It's not really glamorous or glorious, but if you paint yourself as this valiant revolutionary on the front lines of the vanguard that's about to oversee this utopian social justice project, that's kind of a little bit more glamorous, right? It's got a shine to it, and I think a lot of my professors went straight through school, got their degrees, and they're not therapists anymore, right? Their primary goal is to be a professor, to go to these conferences and present and stuff like that. And they're not actually counselors. And I feel like there's that kind of egocentric mindset that has taken over like a lot of people. And it is kind of frustrating because the tough work that you do in therapy is not, in front of an applauding crowd. It's one-on-one, and it's, messy.
Yeah. For us, it's a little ironic that we're supposed to be able to see and diagnose the narcissism when some of us are the worst proponents of it. The word is virtue signaling. What are you signaling to other people? Because the whole left-right thing has, to me, just become about the equivalent of sports teams. By saying things out loud in public, by talking to other people about it, by wearing badges, I think you can figure out what it is I'm trying to say here. All you're doing is virtue signaling. You're saying, what team am I on? And why do you need to do that? Why do you need people to know what team you're on? Because that doesn't matter. It just doesn't. Especially in therapy. If you're disclosing your political beliefs or your ideology in therapy, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're not. That is not part of our... As a matter of fact, the Code of Ethics specifically states that we're not supposed to be interjecting that. It's not about our values. And what are you going to do? I think about this for a lot of people that I know. What are you going to do when you have a client that you don't agree with that starts talking about politics? Are you going to get into a screaming and pissing match in the middle of a session? No, obviously not. So how are you going to learn how to control yourself? Because that's the thing I get concerned about a lot, is seeing people. I feel like people have lost the ability to control themselves in this environment.
I feel like there's this just obsession with being able to correctly and appropriately treat every potential identity group, like every possible intersectionality combination, you have to be able to treat them appropriately. But when it comes to like conservatives, Republicans, and especially Trump supporters, it's just like they're beings from a foreign world or something. This is true of both students and professors. I had this one professor talking about how she was just flabbergasted and dumbfounded. She had a client who was a Trump supporter and had no clue how to deal with her. She was just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to connect with this person, And it's like, if you had a disabled, half black, half indigenous, transgender, neurodivergent, like you start adding all those, it's like, but probably even that person wouldn't get good care because they're kind of being put on this artificial pedestal where you're supposed to, treat them like, almost like a child that you're glorifying in a sense. It's kind of weird. It like minorities in a lot of ways are infantilized, not actually treated with like equal respect and dignity. So yeah,
100%. And it's an interesting conundrum we find ourselves in. But you're right. Like, how is it we can go to something so specific like that, but you can't handle the most basic of people? Because the reality is that it's more than half the country.
Yeah.
Right. More than half the country is that what you just said, right? Trump supporting, conservative leaning people, more than half the country. So you're telling me you can't sit down and talk with more than half the country? That's a problem. How can you be a therapist that way, right? Like, I'm not saying you have to be able to agree with everybody, but like, if you are expected to sit down and to be able to level with somebody who's a child sex offender and be able to treat them the same way as everybody else, you're telling me you feel more comfortable talking to somebody like that than you do like a conservative? That seems very odd, and it seems to be more of a problem that we are not talking about altogether, because it's the reality is you're going to run into people like this, and this is really a problem I feel like has only been in the last 8 years, because like, where was this before? I'm only 33, but I've asked my parents, my grandparents, if there was ever a time in their lives where things were this divided and people were this separated by politics, and they said no, there wasn't. It's never been like this. You used to not talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's always, since I was a child, been some degree of demonization of the other side, but it's like where it is now is there's such a level of total moral depravity. It's like I wouldn't even want to be in your presence. Like when Trump supporters are talked about in my program, there's this ick factor. Like there's something icky about you. I wouldn't want that in my office. I wouldn't want you to get your Trumpness on my couch. Like there's something, like you have this like disease in a sense. It's weird how, it's yeah, like there's the moral depravity piece, but there's also like a visceral disgust factor when you talk about that population.
Yeah, and for people who love him or hate him, but Jordan Peterson talks about disgust, and disgust. I'm trying to think of a way to describe this, but when you get to the level of disgust, you're really reaching the extreme emotion-wise. When you get to the level of disgust, your marriage is over. Right? When you get to the level of disgust, you're capable of probably just about anything, including violence, right? The facial expressions, right? Disgust is a very distinct facial expression. Are you going to be able to control that in your session? Like, that's one of those things. Again, it's like what I said before about I feel like people have lost their ability to have control over themselves. When did it become our job to be the moral arbiters of anything?
So you're pretty early in your program, but I want you to tell me what you're seeing so far in this regard.
Honestly, it's not. It's really not super heavy on it. I mean, again, it's just the beginning. There are some mentions of social justice and culturalism. The thing that I see the most is the emphasis on trauma, the trauma focus, which I think is kind of an odd thing, because like I feel like every single program is trauma informed. If they're all trauma informed, what's the point of saying that? Is it a speciality? Like,
it's a buzzword.
It is a buzzword.
Yeah.
It is a buzzword, just like the golden standard of therapy.
Yeah.
When in reality, the evidence shows that all of them are about as effective as each other. Not one of them is any more necessarily more effective. So there's a lot of buzzwords. A lot of buzzwords. Trauma focused, multiculturalism. Gender fluidity, all that kind of stuff. But I think in my program there seems to be an emphasis to not get into it, to stay away from it. Some of that stuff is in our textbooks, but I would say that my professors have done a good job of really not. It's not like we're sitting down and having like open debates about politics, which is what I was afraid of, because again, I don't care, but I'm not paying to go to school for that. If I wanted to go to school to learn about politics, I would have picked a political, program, but I didn't. I want to learn about therapy in my clients and how I can help them. So we'll see how it goes. But I can tell you, it's obvious it leans one direction. Again, it's unidirectional. And if we really cared about diversity, wouldn't that also include people we don't agree with?
I definitely felt like that in some of my classes where the overt social justice stuff was pretty small. But even in those classes, the way I would describe it is it kind of felt like social justice hangs in the air a little bit. And I'm wondering if you feel like that, just for me personally, there's certain words or phrases you wouldn't use. Like I would never say, help the client gain personal responsibility. Like that's not a phrase that I would use because that's like right-wing coded. which makes you like a bigoted, ignorant fascist. You know what I mean? Like there's certain like words and phrases you just know to take out of your vocabulary.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and like I'm pretty center, as far as politics are concerned. I really, I mean, Jesus, I up until the last couple of years, I really never cared about it. Certainly, when I was in the military, I didn't care. I was completely oblivious to it. But I'm center, like I'm as far away from the extremes as I can try to be. I mean, I feel like it's hard these days to be center anything, but I really try. But I can tell you that I don't feel comfortable about talking about anything like that with any of my classmates or my professors. God forbid, I would never, because even if it's something that they totally agree with, I don't want to risk saying something that's offensive that would get me, labeled as a right-wing person. Because again, like I'm not, but it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like there is no center anymore. You're either right-wing or you're left-wing or whatever, and I don't want to play that game. It's not interesting to me. I'm there to do a job. I'm there to learn how to be a counselor. So that's why some of that stuff is kind of hard for me, because I'm just like, I just don't have a stomach for it.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. I mean, I feel pretty centrist. I feel like in the 90s, I would have been center left, and on my campus, I feel far right wing. Like, I didn't vote for Trump any of the 3 times he's run, but I feel like my views would be just considered very MAGA, and things that I don't consider controversial, like don't castrate mentally ill children in the name of transgender rights. That doesn't seem controversial to me, but it would be extremely controversial on my campus. You know what I mean? And again, I hang out with Republican friends, and I feel like pretty left wing, and I hang out on my college campus, and I feel far right wing. It's kind of a confusing place to be.
And I think that all that means is that I don't think any of what either side believes is actually real, to be completely honest. I think a lot of what has been experienced in the last, 8 years or so is manufactured. Some of it by our enemies. It's very easy to manipulate people with social media nowadays. And I think it's really easy for our enemies to manipulate us. That's just my personal opinion. I don't think, because if you ask people, here's the thing. How likely is it that we're so divided you can't talk to the either side? And even if you try to, it ends up in a meltdown of screaming or I'm just not talking to you. That's wild. That's kind of weird, right? Like, don't you think if you really believe in something, you'd be able to debate it and defend it? But if you can't, it doesn't seem like you have a very strong argument. And if your argument is just that, well, I'm right and you're wrong, that's not an argument at all. That seems very strange to me. It doesn't seem real. It seems very artificial.
Do you think that some of that has to do with the way social media, like the algorithms, create these echo chambers and bubbles? Do you think that plays a big factor?
100%. I actually, in my undergraduate, I did a research project with my professor on TikTok, and we found some pretty disturbing results, if I'm being completely honest. It wasn't focused on politics. It was just focused on the emotional stability of college students who use TikTok chronically, and basically what you would expect to find, we did find. But the algorithms, the reality is nobody really understands what the algorithms are or how they work, because they're intellectual property. Okay, but here's what we do know. They basically work in the same way. If anybody that's taken a psychology class knows about schedules of reinforcement, the most effective schedule of reinforcement is randomized reward, meaning that you get a reward at a random time, not on a scheduled time. So if you were to get a reward, and I know you know this, I'm just explaining for people listening. If you were to get a reward every hour on the hour, let's just say it's like a treat, right? You'd get bored of that. You'd get tired of getting the treat eventually. But if it's random, what we've seen in animals is that they will keep doing whatever task you're having them do as long as they keep getting the random treat, the random reward. The algorithms, especially on TikTok, are the same way. That's why when you go into TikTok, I don't use it, but I've used it enough to understand how it works. When you're on TikTok, if you first log in, probably the first 3 videos will be something that you want to see. If you're there to see puppies or something like that, you're going to see 3 videos of puppies right away. Then the 10 videos after that won't have anything to do with it, most likely, because the algorithm's trying to find out what else do you like, what else can we show you. And if you spend even a second 2 seconds looking at something other than your puppy videos, it's going to be like, oh, they're semi-interested in cats. Let's send them a couple videos of cats and see if they bite. Oh, they spent more seconds on it. That's how it develops, right? So now when you're talking about political ideology, here's the deal. If you hate something, you're likely to watch it just as much as you are if you do like it. So if you hate the right, or if you hate the left, and videos keep popping up of Bernie Sanders talking or Donald Trump talking, and you're so angry, you hate these people so much, well, guess what? You're telling the algorithm doesn't know that you hate it or like it just knows that you're watching it.
And if you leave a nasty comment, that's still a bonus for the algorithm.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
that's how they work.
That's really. This is kind of like a somewhat off topic. Did you ever read about how B.F. Skinner created superstition in pigeons? He would variable time reward them kind of randomly on a random schedule, and whatever the pigeon was doing, say turning counterclockwise, the pigeon would assume this is what's getting me the reward, so they do that motion constantly. And invariably, the next time the reward came, they would be turning counterclockwise. So they just assume that this is like creating the reward. I'm wondering if there's like some version of that happens in people.
Well, like I said before, put it to you this way. What do you think our enemies are doing to us? If it's that easy to trick people and to manipulate them through social media, because that's how it's being done, as typically referred to as fifth generational warfare. In the past, warfare has always been conducted with planes, tanks, and rifles, right? But these days, warfare isn't just about those things. That's some of it, right? Those things are very destructive and can screw up economies and people's way of life. But if you can use a weapon that doesn't destroy buildings and doesn't wreck the economy, and all people have to do is sit and look at their phone, you've got a real weapon on your hands. If you
create something that allows a nation to tear itself apart, you don't need tanks. It's correct. Wow. Yeah.
Think about the Gaza stuff, right? The protests with Gaza. You had students overthrowing their universities and setting up camp on the university. And again, I'm not making a moral argument for whether they should or shouldn't have, but you haven't seen anything like that since really the 70s. And from what I understand, I don't even know that level was happening in the 70s. There were certainly protests, but when did you ever think in your lifetime you would see a bunch of college students overthrowing their universities and setting up camp and having to be forcefully removed by the police over something that's happening in another country? It doesn't even have anything to do with us.
Yeah. It's kind of, you spin it in such a way that in certain circles, I'm thinking of the first thing to pop in my head is, Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist, wrote a book called Virtue Signaling about kind of the evolutionary mindset of what creates virtue signaling. And if you're in these spaces, especially at a Columbia or a Yale, these elite college campuses, a big way that you signal I am a fit mate or I am a good friend, I'd be a good friend material or a good mate material, is having the right ideas. Looking good is important. Having access to resources is important. But, we've developed this idea where there's certain, like a fitness capacity, or a good quality fitness is determined by the beliefs you hold. So you say, I believe there's a genocide going on in Palestine, and that is, morally abhorrent. That tells people, A, I'm moral enough to hold these views. B, I'm intelligent enough to hold the right views. Right. Therefore, you should let me into your club. So there's this kind of sophisticated social element of this whole thing. And I'm sure a lot of people, if you were to separate them from the herd for a minute and be like, how much of this do you really believe? How much are you really willing to sacrifice for? You get a very different answer.
So many students, when they were on these protests, during these protests or occupying their campuses, they were asked, well, where is Gaza on the map? No clue. Mm-hmm. Well, what are the policies? What are these things in Gaza? Right. The fact, if you truly care about LGBTQ rights and trans rights and all of those things, Gaza's not the place you should be supporting.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ! That's one of the most insane things I've ever seen. When you're seeing these signs that say "Queers for Palestine,"
yeah.
Jesus, do you see any signs like that in Palestine, in Gaza? No, that's insane.
That's probably the most bizarre contradiction of intersectionality that I've seen.
oh my God. And again, that's not to say that there isn't horrible things happening there. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that there was actually a really good video I watched. That it was a person in drag, and they were walking around university areas, and they were asking people, "Oh, who do you support, Gaza or Israel?" And the person wearing drag, it was an obvious, like, I don't know if it was a setup or if it was just trying to cognate people's minds, right? But of course, everybody sees this person in drag, right? Oh, I'm pro-Palestine, and then the person in drag is like, why? If I were in Palestine, I'd be killed, I'd be beheaded. But in Israel, they are pro-gay, they are pro-LGBTQ. Did you know that? No, I didn't know that. And then this person starts spouting off facts about what's been happening in Israel, and then again, what their beliefs are in Palestine. And again, this is not a moral argument about whether horrible things are happening there or not. We're talking about just like as you said, what do people really believe, and what is actually the truth? The truth matters. It matters. And if you're believing in an ideology that's telling you one thing that's completely the opposite of what the truth is, you're living in a perpetual state of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I think the Palestinian thing is one thing, because there's actually a real war going on there. So it's how you respond to it is at least somewhat based in reality, even if you're exaggerating. But a lot of the stuff with social justice is a complete fabrication, like a hallucination, paranoid delusions. Think about microaggressions. If I said, I think America is the land of opportunity, or I think America is the melting pot, this is considered horrifically offensive. And in one of my classes, they said microaggressions are on par with murder. And you think, I think one of the examples that we were giving is like kind of awkwardly complimenting a black woman's hair. It's like, okay, maybe you should learn how to speak to people differently in a way that they would, feel respected. But I don't know if that's the same as murder. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Considering the fact I've been in a war zone, I know what murder looks like. I've seen it. And, again, working in a jail, I can tell you right now, their priorities are not social justice related. At least nobody ever disclosed that to me. But this is the world that we live in. That's why I've made the point here today several times. It's like, how far are we willing to go? Because it's not just a matter of how far are we willing to go. It's how much are we willing to lose by believing these things and doubling down on them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I wanted to shift a little bit to talking about your book, What's Under the Mask. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I wrote a book. So a lot of it is based on what I experienced working in the jail. The first chapter, specifically, I'm talking about, I was given permission to conduct 2 interviews with 2 inmates. And I picked these inmates based on their psychological profile that was based on my opinion. One of them being that I was under the impression that they fit the cuff for antisocial personality disorder, and the other one, narcissistic personality disorder, using DSM criteria and all of that. Again, these interviews that were conducted were not serving as diagnosis at all. I was just curious to see how much of what they had to say would line up with what's in the DSM-5 and based on the psychopathy checklist. And what I found was interesting. Again, some things matched up, some things didn't. But I think what the bulk of what I found interesting was just what these individuals had to say. And again, I think, interestingly enough, still talking about a social justice perspective, this individual that I had talked to, that I'm convinced had antisocial personality. I mean, if I'd ever met a person in my life who was a real life psychopath, it was this guy. He had been arrested and incarcerated many times, even at a young age, and for all sorts of different crimes: drug possession, drug dealing, assault with a weapon, kidnapping, avoiding the police. Any time that the police tried to pull him over, he would floor it. He was in a high-speed pursuit. He would never just willingly surrender himself. And so in my internship, I sat in on groups for drug and alcohol related stuff, and that's how I got to know these 2 individuals. And while I listened in group, I picked up on some of these things that I had been learning in my classes, and I was like, wow, this guy is a psychopath. Like, the stuff he's saying, it's not only is it stuff I would imagine a psychopath would say, if you read the DSM and you read these other things. So like the guy that I really kind of followed was Dr. Robert Hare. He was the world's leading expert on psychopathy. And in his book, Without Conscience, I read that, and he spent a lot of time working in prisons. And a lot of the stuff he was talking about was the same thing I was seeing here. And we can get into the details of the interview. They gave me permission to use these interviews how I see fit. That's why I was able to include them in the book and stuff. But then I kind of get into the different categories of criminals. I talk about your CEO related, corporate psychopaths,
White collar
killers. Yeah. And then even just like regular crime, like drug cartels. I talk about internet trolling and internet crimes, antisocial behavior. Yeah, actually, it's really fascinating. I'm currently working on a project with a professor right now. We created an online assessment for internet trolling, and we're going to relate it to the dark tetrad, because we believe that, and we're not talking about just like your basic internet trolls. I'm talking about people who this is their lifestyle. This is what they do for fun every day, all day.
Yeah.
They go online and they're trying to harass people. There's evidence to suggest that they are on par and that they are showing dark tetrad traits like psychopathy and sadism. So the book covers a lot of that.
Wow, that is so fascinating. I want to run something by you. This is something I've been tossing around in my head, but I have no empirical data to support me. A lot of the new online right, the political right, like people try to pin it to white supremacy or fascism or these like historical ideologies. And like I would say the underlying ideology, if there is one for a lot of these people, is not some like historic, conservatism, fascism, anything like that. It is the trolling. Like a lot of the online right is rooted in trolling. Like that's their kind of, saying something ridiculous and offensive to trigger you. It's like a lot of what motivates them. And, I heard someone say, we trolled Trump into the White House. I don't know if you've heard of Angela Nagel. She's an Irish scholar. She wrote a book called Kill All Normies. And I think that'd be a fascinating one for you, because it kind of details a lot of kind of online left and online right, how they just spin off into absurdity. But it's really, really interesting. Man, I'm wondering like this, like trolling mentality, how you've seen it affect kind of the social sphere more broadly, I guess.
Well, I mean, a really simple way of looking at this is like today, go on Twitter, X, for an hour, or Reddit, if you really want to be spicy. Spend an hour on there, and then go spend an hour outside and try to talk to people outside in real life. The difference is vastly dramatic, right? And why? Because people don't act that way in real life. At least if they do, most likely they're probably going to get arrested and face charges for some of the stuff that people would do. But the reality is that the online world really doesn't have a lot of consequences unless you live in the UK and you can get arrested for a meme. That's a whole nother conversation. But and I'm not even saying that that's how it should be. I don't think people should be arrested for memes. That's insane. But what I do think is that there are not a lot of repercussions for this online, because when we're saying trolling, what I mean is online antisocial behavior, because that's what it is. If you were to act this way in the real world, it would be considered antisocial behavior. And I'm not talking about just trolling your friend, going on Instagram and commenting like, loser, you know what I mean, or whatever, something harmless. I'm talking about there are people who use anonymous, and there are character features here, anonymous accounts where they pick specific pages, profiles, accounts to go comment on with the intent to cause psychological distress to either the person posting or the people in the comment section. And it's obvious who these people are, because the accounts always have these weird animated pictures with something stupid as their bio, whatever, and they post insane, illogical things on people's things. And again, and it's obvious because you can see it triggers people, as you have said. That's the intent. The intent is to trigger people. I read a study where there are people who will call help centers, so phone help centers, and certain companies have a policy that you cannot hang up the phone unless you are being like violently threatened. So these trolls will call these phone centers and mess with people for hours because they cannot hang up the phone. That is sadistic. They do it because they can, and they enjoy it. It makes them laugh. It brings them entertainment.
I'm wondering. I think there's some difference between somebody who says something offensive online because they're having an extreme emotional reaction. Like, you said you like Donald Trump, and I just hate that so much, so I'm going to call you a fascist. But what you're talking about seems like something different, like something more calculated and like devious in some way, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd say that there's probably more than, it's not like a single one size fits all. I do think that militaries, intelligence agencies around the world are part of this problem.
What do you mean?
I mean, you can look into this, but in Russia, North Korea, China, they have warehouses full of people who do nothing but that. They go on.
So our enemies.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm sure we're doing it too.
Yeah,
I'm absolutely sure we're doing it too. But yeah, would they go on social? I mean, part of the Twitter files that came out when Elon Musk bought Twitter was talking about this kind of stuff. Intelligence agencies had their hands in social media, specifically in Twitter, and they were trying to influence policies, and they were trying to influence people. And to what extent, I don't know. But a good example is the Russia and Ukraine war. I know for a fact, I know lots of people who are involved in that war, and they talk about all the time that part of this stuff is just either propaganda or trolling to piss off the Russians or piss off the Ukrainians. And so they have, battalions or divisions, agencies, whatever, of people who literally are just doing this, going online to poo-poo or stir up trouble online. A good example was one I saw. There was a post about something that happened in Ukraine, and when you tried to go read posts about it, all the comment sections were links to porn. So you couldn't read anybody's real comments because every link to the comments in these posts about this crazy thing that happened, it was all porn. And obviously, it was most likely an intelligence agency trying to prevent people from reading what was going on in there.
That is wild. That is wild. Yeah, I mean, I read a little bit. I think it was Matt Taibbi's stuff on the Twitter files. I read some of that, and that was shocking. But I have no clue just how big this stuff is. I'm sure you're right with Russia, China. There's people. I mean, China controls TikTok. Yeah. I mean, I have no clue what level of psychological subversion they're doing because people are so hooked on this. Like I'll post like a little 60-second clip of this on TikTok, but I don't watch TikTok. I'm almost afraid to watch TikTok. This is wild. And people are going to be sucked in and manipulated in ways they have no clue about.
Right, and I'm not saying all of it is intentional, right? Because the algorithms do a lot of the work for those companies. But I briefly go back to these universities being overthrown on, by students because of the Israeli Gaza protests, right? Like, lots of stuff from that was posted on TikTok, either portraying it in a weird way or specifically portraying it in one way. But you have to ask yourself, like, how is it that so many students were involved in that, in a cause that they literally knew nothing about, couldn't point the country out on a map, couldn't tell you what was actually going on, don't know what the policies are of that country? How does that happen? How can you be so uninformed and so devout to a cause? That doesn't make any sense to me. And I can't help but wonder sometimes if it is a byproduct of, these intelligence operations or just the algorithm showing, you know what I mean? I don't know. Sometimes it's probably an accident. Other times I feel like it's not.
Wow. That is so wild. Yeah, that's really scary. So you have like quite a diverse background: military, working in a jail, addiction treatment. You've got a psych degree. You've done some legit research yourself. How do we fix America going forward?
Wow, that's a great question. But I mean, I don't know that
it's broad.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm qualified to answer it. But I think that what I've said so many times in this podcast is just like, like what are we willing really? It's like a marriage, okay? For people listening to this podcast, they're probably have interest in the field of counseling. So let's talk about it in counseling terms, right? How much is a marriage willing to sacrifice, double down on? Which battles are worth fighting in order to save the marriage? Because if you look at it, the left and the right, it's like a marriage right now. It's like a really bad relationship. How do we fix that? If we were counselors and we were treating the left and the right as a marriage couple, how do we fix that? And I don't know that we can, but I would just reiterate that, like, if we don't think about these things, if we don't ask these really hard questions, if we can't talk to each other, we're never going to fix anything. I would say that's the first thing. We have to find a way to get back to a place where we can talk to each other without screaming bigot and Nazi and whatever. Like, we can't do that anymore. I mean, we can, but it's not going to go anywhere, and our enemies are going to take advantage of us and continue to manipulate us like they're already doing. So how much do we want to give up? How much do we want to double down? And how much are we willing to compromise?
Good answer. And similarly, how do we fix the therapy profession?
I really like Dr. Jonathan Shedler. I don't know if you're.
I love him. Yeah, love him.
He's a really good guy. I think that he is a great example of somebody that is balanced, that understands and recognizes the flaws in our field. He's a psychologist, not a counselor, but still a therapist. I really respect. I really respect him because he posts things that sometimes call out both sides, and kind of like one example. I'll leave you with this. I was at dinner or brunch with my wife a couple months ago, and while we were there, I overheard somebody's conversation about their first time in therapy, and they were talking about how well it went. I was like, oh, that's interesting, and I'm just kind of listening. I mean, I'm eavesdropping, but they were speaking loud enough that I could hear it. And she talked about how her and her therapist trauma bonded for the whole session, and it ended with both of them crying and hugging and holding each other. And I was like, oh my God, like that, she was happy. I mean, and whatever, but you and I both know that is not how that is supposed to go.
No.
There's a lot of things wrong with what's going on in that session, right? I posted that on Twitter, and I got a lot of responses, and Jonathan Shedler was one of them. That is what's wrong with therapy, in my opinion. People are going to be mad about that, and that's fine. Be mad. That is not therapy. That is harmful to everybody involved, client and therapist. We need to fix that, and I think that starts with how we're being taught, what we're being taught, and how we're being trained.
I had a guy on here, a therapist, Jake Wiskershin, and he talked about how some clinic near him had put up a billboard. It said something like, "Need a friend? Get a therapist." It's like, that is so horrible. You set up a professional relationship where someone is paying you to basically pretend like you're their friend. Like, that's horrible, And I feel like there's a lot of people like, yeah, it bothers me. So, final question: what is one thing that we should be talking about that we're not talking about?
God, there's probably a lot. I think the overemphasis of everything being trauma. I mean, and some people are talking about this, but I don't know, maybe I can just be one of them. I mean, there's a lot of things I would like to, but at risk of getting myself in trouble, I feel like I probably shouldn't say them out loud. But I think the overemphasis on trauma is concerning because, like, how do we work from that? If everything's trauma, how do we even work from that? Because it can't all be trauma, right? It can't all be, like, I was just reading in my textbook and the other day, and we are talking about all the different types of trauma. That's totally valid, right? An environmental disaster, you survive an earthquake, okay? You survived 9/11, okay? You survived being in combat, okay? And it's like, but it's like once you start really making this list, like, the fact that we don't really have a true definition of trauma, I feel like that's concerning, because then everything can be. And I don't know that that's healthy for us to say that everything is trauma.
I like that answer. Do you know Christine Hoff Sommers?
No, I'm not familiar.
She's an interesting thinker, philosophy professor. I really like her. She has this quote where she says, "We're not setting up a good standard if we categorize or if we define trauma as anything that traumatizes you." Right? Yeah, it has perverse consequences down the road. Well,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like when I was in the army, I was having some issues, and I attended a group therapy for soldiers. And while I was in there, I assumed everybody that was going to be in there would have had combat experience, and that is why they had PTSD. And that wasn't the case. I was really one of the only people that had ever seen actual combat. The rest of the people, it was always secondhand something or other. Seeing, knowing somebody that died, or their mail room where they worked in at the base got hit by a rocket. They weren't in it when they got hit by a rocket, but it's just the fact that they got hit by a rocket was traumatizing for them. And I'm not saying that that's not traumatic. I'm just saying that, like, how can all of these people in this group get treatment? Like, I'm talking about, like, I've been blown up by an IED. I was literally in a, almost a gunfight at point blank range with some Afghan army guys in the middle of the night. Didn't know why. They just turned on us, and like, that is scary. I'm not saying that other people's trauma is less severe than what I experienced, but how do you work with people when you have such a vast difference of what we're defining as trauma? I mean, even in just that room, how do you think it feels for the guy that's talking about being traumatized because his mailroom got blown up? He wasn't in it, but his mailroom got blown up. And then you're over here listening to me talk about, almost getting killed by an Afghan army soldier in the middle of the night because they turned on us, and I'm shitting my pants because I'm scared that this dude's holding an AK-47 literally at point blank range to me. Like, how do you it's not even a fair comparison. And I feel like it can be almost hurtful when you're trying to be in a group setting like that, and you're trying to say, like, oh, well, everybody's trauma is the same, and it's like,
no, it's not.
I don't know. Maybe it is, but I don't know. It seems like we need to have
I think it was
better
Christina Hoff Sommers who was saying, we use the word trauma to describe everything from being lined up in front of a firing squad to being anxious about having lunch with somebody. And if that word describes both those things, or all the different stuff that you're talking about, that word really doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like, how much of what we're saying is trauma is actually just anxiety? How much of what we're saying is trauma is actually just depression? Is it trauma? Like, and then it's like, oh, well, it is trauma, and that's why they're depressed. Is it? Like, I don't know. It just seems like we don't. And maybe this is something that will be worked on. Maybe this is something new that our field is going to approach differently. I don't know. I'm just saying that right now, like, the fact that we can't even define trauma, I think, is an issue.
I heard one psychologist stating that watching a traumatic event on TV could be considered trauma. So, like, watching 9/11 on TV could be considered trauma. So basically everybody in America except for the Amish has PTSD. Like, these such horrible definitions. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's certainly not helpful. I mean, how can you even work from that, right? Like, and honestly, in my opinion, at least for me, it's a little invalidating, right? Like, my trauma is the same as these guys in this room next to me. Like, I can tell you that sitting in that room, and I'm in a different place now, we're talking about like 10, almost 10 years ago. But, as I'm sitting there listening to these guys tell their stories that are vastly different than what happened to me, it feels a little invalidating to be like, oh yeah, everybody's trauma is the same. What you experienced is the same as him. Pardon me. He wasn't in the explosion. I was in the explosion. You know what I mean? I feel like that is different. It's not to invalidate his feelings about what happened to him and his experience, but you certainly shouldn't invalidate people who were in it. It'd be like invalidating a victim of rape by somebody who knew somebody who got raped. Right? Is their trauma the same?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's certain areas where we know this. Like, if you had a situation where, like, a racial minority was uncomfortable, like, in the classroom, and I would say, like, oh, I'm also uncomfortable in this situation, that'd be very clearly like, I as a white man could not understand your experience. Like, that's offensive for you to try to pretend that those are the same, but for some reason with trauma, it doesn't have the same type of salience, I guess. And so you're just kind of allowed to throw that as a blanket term wherever.
Yeah, and so hopefully that's something that we work on. And I imagine, our field really isn't that old, and I think that we are going to get better. To be clear though, I don't know how much we're going to actually get done unless we start tackling some of these political issues. You know what I mean? Like, none of that matters if all of these programs just all overnight become not accredited anymore, and the accrediting body isn't going to change their policies. I think that's the biggest issue at hand right now, because again, it's not a matter of whether it's right or wrong. You can be right all day long, but if you don't accord with federal law, and you allow your policies to become invalid, and now you have all these programs that are not accredited, we're not helping anybody. So I think that's probably right now anyways, I think that's the biggest problem we're facing.
Yeah, I agree. We're headed for a showdown in the field, definitely. Yeah, it could get ugly. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it doesn't, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be, because we can still prioritize things like cultural perspectives and treating people fairly. You know what I mean? Because like, if that's really what this is, I'm trying to tread lightly here. If what we care about is treating people fairly and being trauma informed and appreciating other people's cultures, then it shouldn't be a real big issue to not approach it from a DEI perspective. Are you telling me that's the only way that we can appreciate people's culture and treat people fairly? Or is there something else behind that?
I definitely think there's something else behind that, because if I were to say, hey, I really want a multicultural perspective in this program that is rooted in civil rights era liberalism, right? What they want and what they believe in as, one of the ultimate goods in this world is pushing critical race theory, which is rooted in Marxism, right? And so our ideas are fundamentally incompatible in such a way that they would look at me trying to use MLK as a beacon for where to take multiculturalism. They would look at that as like a moral depravity. Like, you are too privileged and blinded and bigoted to understand that critical race theory is the appropriate way for us to go from here. So like, it sounds nice. We could come to an agreement on multiculturalism. I don't think we will. I think it's going to be a dirty fight.
Well, I mean, and I love those posts. You just had one recently where it's like, we went from it's not happening to okay, it's happening to okay, it's happening and it's good. I think that's exactly what this is. Like, for so long, people didn't want to admit that this is rooted in Marxism, right? Which it absolutely is, and that's a problem. And I think there are two classes of people. There are people who know that and they're just trying to deny it. But then I think there's a lot of people who are uneducated, who don't even know who Marx is, Karl Marx or Marxism. I don't think they have the slightest clue what that is. But I do think it's getting to the point where it's like, no, it's not happening. Okay, it is happening. Okay, it's happening and it's good. If you're getting to the point where you're trying to defend Karl Marx and Marxism, you've lost.
Yeah.
This is the United States. It ain't gonna fly.
Yeah, and I think what's tough is, Marxism in the 20th century was basically completely discredited. So what they've done, it was actually a brilliant move on their part. They just hide behind identity. So it's, in this case, it'd be Marxism hiding behind race, which is a brilliant strategy, because then you're like, I don't really know about this. That's because you're a racist. It's a genius rhetorical tactic.
Yeah, you can't do this because you're a bigot, right? Like, and then that's kind of why, in my opinion, I think that's kind of why the left is losing the political sphere right now. Like, it doesn't really work to call people racist anymore. It doesn't really work to call people a bigot or a Nazi. Like, I mean, at this point, you're just basically saying, like, everyone in America is a Nazi. Everyone that doesn't agree with you is a bigot. That's not an argument. It's not even close to a valid argument. It's not, you know what I mean? Like, that's how children think.
I would say it worked pretty well for about 10 years. And it's become very obvious lately that they've dramatically overplayed their hand.
Yeah, that's the truth. You're right. It did work for a while, but I think it was because people didn't understand. And I don't think that people could rationalize the fact that this was happening, because this isn't, in my opinion, this isn't really I don't think this is how we've really done things in the United States. So like these small minor changes, and people are good hearted. Like that's the thing. It's the empathy. Empathy has been weaponized, right? Like you're talking about like people that are, you're saying these people, oh, minorities are underprivileged, people of color are underprivileged, LGBTQ, they're all underprivileged. Like nobody wants to hear that and say, oh, that's stupid. Everybody hears that and they're like, well, damn, I don't want them to be underprivileged. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I don't want anybody to not be able to. This is America. I want everybody to have what they deserve, And then it's like, okay, well, or where we are currently in the United States. I mean, maybe not now. You could make an argument that not right at this moment, but like in the last 4 years, who's more privileged than some of those people I just named? I can tell you right now who wasn't privileged: straight white people. And how is it that they're still the privileged at the top of the privilege totem pole when, like, in a lot of settings you're basically told you're straight and white, don't talk, your opinion's not valid here? What? How much privilege is that? It doesn't really seem like privilege. It seems like an inverse racism that and maybe I'm wrong. I'm totally willing to admit that I'm wrong on that. But and then again, it's not in every environment. It's not in every environment. It's not in every university, but certainly in the elements of the government, in certain things, in certain sections, it definitely felt like that.
I did in a section of my book, a chapter in my book about the demographics of wokeness, and the 3 characteristics that were most likely to predict a person being woke is having higher education, making over $100,000 a year, and being white. Like, this was a very, very privileged movement. This idea that this is like a grassroots, outcry of the marginalized, that was all nonsense. Like, this is, highly educated people with professional jobs who really want job security. And so they create this entire language and this entire worldview where you have to know the language and know the worldview in order to be kind of part of this class. I mean, it was very much like drawing a moat, around your class privilege, essentially.
Yeah, at least that's what it feels like,
Yeah.
I do want to reiterate though that like there's lots of people, especially in our field, it's because they care. They hear these things and they don't fully understand where this is coming from. They just want to be a good person, and they want, they're like, of course I love everybody, of course I want to treat everybody with respect.
Yeah, I mean, I've met a number of people like in this profession where it's like, I had a close friend who was gay, who grew up in a small town and got bullied and had religious trauma or religious church hurt, whatever, from that. And it's like, that's totally a good reason to want to focus on LGBTQ issues. Like, I totally get that. Like, I respect that. I have no judgment there. I think when it turns into kind of like a personality, I just what instantly came to my mind in like a faculty area at my university. You walk down the hall and every single professor's office has that Progress Pride flag on it. Like every single one. It's like you used to see that with American flags, and now it's like that's what's replaced it, right? It's it's an entire worldview, not just I want to be sympathetic to my gay friend. It's like this is how the world works.
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, it's become the equivalent of sports teams.
Yeah,
that's what team I'm on. I don't know much about it. I don't know the background or where this comes from. It's like people who want to talk about Foucault. I hear people talk about Foucault a lot in counseling, and I'm like, do some research about who Foucault really was. Like if I wouldn't really want to be putting my name next to anything related to his. Just FYI.
No.
I'm not even gonna spoiler alert for anybody. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go look who Foucault is and the French philosopher, and go read about some of the things he's attributed with.
Well, I could spoil it a little bit. He was a child rapist. And I was telling somebody the other day, I was trying to explain to somebody, like, kind of one of those I'm not the bad guy conversations. And I was like, look, taking Marxism, which is the most murderous ideology in human history, and filtering it through a child rapist and then hiding behind identity, it's like, that doesn't make you the good guy, And it's hard to explain this to people who, like, that's their narrative, that's their worldview.
I have pretty much completely given up on talking with people at this current stage. One, because it's not helpful. you have to be willing to listen, and you have to be willing to understand somebody else's perspective. And if you can't, there's no room for even to talk. I'm willing to have conversations, and for me, that started during COVID. I had some very serious concerns around COVID and policies that were happening, and now we know, like, we know COVID most likely, everyone now admits they most likely came from the Wuhan Institute and was most likely an engineered, whether you want to call it a bioweapon or it was, manufactured to help create new vaccines, whatever it was, it doesn't even matter at this point. They made it. They made it worse than it really was, and it leaked from there. Nobody's ever apologized for being wrong about that. Nobody's ever apologized for calling people conspiracy theorists for that.
And racist and xenophobic.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Here we are. But here we are. So forgive me if I'm not really interested in having conversations with people that were feeling like that and haven't changed their opinions.
Yeah. It is tough. It is tough. It's like speaking different languages from somebody else. It really is. Well, Cameron, thank you so much for coming on. This is a fascinating conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm happy to be here, and maybe some topics we can cover next time, or some of the categories from my book, talking about the different I'd love to talk about that. I can talk about that stuff for days, but the different psychology perspectives of different criminal-minded individuals.
I'd love that. I'd absolutely love that. If you'll hang around for just a second until the upload finishes, I'll see you next time.